Captain Cale Orris stood on the bridge of the Etherian, the expansive control deck illuminated by the muted glow of crystalline displays. Beyond the viewport, the void stretched infinitely, pinpricked by distant stars that flickered like dying embers. The ship glided silently through uncharted space, its sleek hull slicing through the cosmic canvas as though the universe itself parted for its presence. The air inside the bridge carried a sterile crispness, a subtle bite of the recycled atmosphere. It mingled with the faint tang of minerals from the alloyed panels, a scent Cale had long associated with exploration and duty. His gloved hand traced the edge of the control panel absently, the cool metal grounding him in the monotony of their mission. "Routine sweeps of nowhere," Cale muttered, his gravelly tone carrying just enough volume to reach Lieutenant Ryn at the sensor station. "Remind me again why the Council insists on chasing ghosts in dead systems?" Ryn glanced up, his youthful features shadowed by the pale light of his monitors. His shoulders stiffened, a subtle tell of unease. "Data collection protocols, Captain. They want every corner of this sector cataloged." "Cataloged?" Cale tasted the word like ash. He pivoted on his heel, boots echoing softly against the deck. "Do they plan to archive boredom next? Because we're delivering it in spades." The bridge crew chuckled lightly, though the sound lacked warmth. The camaraderie aboard the Etherian had worn thin over weeks of silence, the void swallowing their morale one star system at a time. Kyle let his gaze drift over his crew. Ryn, steadfast but anxious. Hilar, the stoic navigation officer plotting paths no one cared to follow, and a handful of technicians stationed at consoles, their heads bowed in focus. Each carried the weariness of endless nothingness. "Captain," Ryn's voice cut through the muted hum of their tasks, a note of sharpness slicing through the mundane. "I'm picking up something unusual." Cale's attention snapped back, his posture straightening. "Define unusual." Ryn's fingers danced over the interface, the soft clatter of keys filling the bridge. The displays around him shifted, streams of data cascading like digital waterfalls. "It's faint, but it's not background radiation or debris. It's—" He hesitated, the pause heavy with uncertainty. "It's deliberate. A signal." The word sent a ripple through the crew. Hellar turned in his seat, his weathered features tightening. "From where?" Ryn shook his head, his eyes fixed on the flickering data. "Hard to say. It's bouncing erratically, almost like it's phasing." Cale moved closer, leaning over Ryn's station. The data on the screen was chaotic, jagged lines intersecting in patterns that defied logic. His brow furrowed. "Phasing how?" "Quantum instability, maybe." Ryn's voice grew quieter, as if the signal itself demanded reverence. "It's shifting between states, refusing to stabilize. And there's an auditory layer embedded in it." Cale's heartbeat quickened. He straightened, crossing his arms. "Play it." Ryn hesitated, his finger hovering over the control. Then, with a slight nod, he activated the feed. The bridge speakers crackled, a sharp distortion that clawed at the senses. Beneath the static, something emerged. A fragmented voice, disjointed, yet undeniably human. "Run!" The single word hung in the air like a ghostly whisper, its resonance clawing into their minds. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the sound pressing against them like an invisible force. Did anyone else feel that? Hellar's voice was low, almost disbelieving. Kyle ignored the comment, his focus locked on Ryn. "Clean it up. I want clarity." "I'll try," Ryn replied, already adjusting filters and algorithms. The signal shifted slightly, the distortion lessened, but the voice remained fractured, as though it had traveled across millennia to reach them. "Run." Cale's throat tightened. There was something primal in that word, a plea laced with fear so ancient it transcended language. He tore his gaze from the display, addressing the crew. "Is this some remnant of old human tech? A satellite malfunction?" Hellar frowned. "Unlikely. That system was obliterated. Whatever survived shouldn't be broadcasting." "Unless someone wanted it to," Ryn murmured. The ship's AI chimed in, its synthetic tone devoid of emotion. Signal triangulation complete. Origin point, 3.72 light-years from current position. "Hilar," Kyle barked. "Adjust our course. Bring us in visual range." "Yes, sir," Hilar replied, fingers deftly plotting the new trajectory. The ship shifted slightly, the view through the main viewport tilting as the navigation systems engaged. Stars blurred momentarily before settling into new alignments. Kyle returned to his seat, the leather creaking softly beneath him. His mind raced, the signal's implications gnawing at his disciplined exterior. Humanity had been a fable for generations, a tale of hubris and ruin. To find something left behind after 100,000 years felt impossible, and yet here it was. "Captain," Rin interrupted, his tone urgent. "The signal. It's amplifying." "What do you mean?" Kyle asked. "It's reacting to us. The closer we get, the stronger it becomes, almost like it knows we're listening." Kyle's jaw clenched. "What about interference? Any signs of—" Before he could finish, the bridge lights dimmed briefly, a flicker that sent an involuntary chill through the room. Panels sparked faintly, the displays rebooting as a low vibration rippled through the ship's frame. The crew froze, their unease thickening. "Status report," Kyle demanded, his voice sharper now. Rin checked his monitors, his expression tight. "Systems are stable, but whatever that pulse was, it's tied to the signal." Kyle exhaled slowly, his instincts prickling. "Keep monitoring. Hilar, ETA to the signal's origin?" 20 minutes, Hilar replied, assuming no complications. Kyle nodded, leaning back slightly. The weight of uncertainty settled on his shoulders, heavier than the artificial gravity anchoring them. He glanced at Rin, who was still analyzing the signal with an intensity that bordered on obsession. "Rin," Kale said, his tone quieter but firm, "don't get lost in it. Whatever this is, we face it together." Rin hesitated, then gave a small nod, his focus breaking momentarily. "Understood, Captain." Kyle turned his gaze back to the viewport. In the distance, a faint glimmer caught his eye, a nebulous distortion, almost imperceptible. It pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat in the darkness, growing stronger with each passing second. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. Waiting. The voice echoed in his mind, unbidden. "Run." The distortion grew larger as the Etherian crept closer to the signal's origin. It shimmered in the darkness, like a mirage caught in a timeless desert, pulsating with an unsteady rhythm that seemed both chaotic and calculated. Every flicker, every ripple, felt alive, an entity struggling to exist in the physical realm. Kale Orris sat stiffly in his command chair, his eyes locked on the anomaly ahead. The tension on the bridge was palpable. It clung to the air like static before a storm, making every sound sharper, every breath heavier. The muted clicks of fingers on consoles carried an edge, as though the ship itself held its breath. "Status?" Kale asked, his voice breaking the silence like a stone dropped into still water. "We're within range," Hilar replied without turning. His tone was calm but clipped, a veteran's mask for unease. "Visual on the anomaly should stabilize now." The main display flickered to life, and the image of the distortion appeared with eerie clarity. It wasn't just an anomaly. It was a fracture, a jagged wound carved into space. Wisps of light spilled from its edges, shifting hues like an oil slick caught in sunlight, but far colder, far more alien. "What am I looking at?" Kale's words felt heavier, as though the question alone carried weight. "Unknown," Rin said, his voice barely above a whisper. He leaned closer to his console, the lines of data streaming like an indecipherable torrent. "The signal originates from within. That. The quantum instability is off the charts." The ship shuddered lightly, as if caught in an invisible current. Kale gripped the armrest of his chair, feeling the faint tremor through the metal. It wasn't turbulence. It was the kind of disruption that spoke to forces beyond understanding. He glanced at Rin. "What's causing that?" Rin hesitated, his fingers hovering over the console. "Best guess? The anomaly is interacting with our energy fields. It's pushing back." Pushing back, Kale echoed. He felt a chill crawl across his skin, like the ghost of a forgotten fear. Against us? Or something else? Before Rin could answer, the anomaly pulsed violently, and the bridge lights dimmed once more. A low vibration resonated through the ship's frame, deeper and more guttural than before, as if the void itself were growling in protest. Sparks leapt from a nearby console, and one of the technicians cursed under his breath, recoiling. "Shields are holding," Hellar said, his tone steady but taut. "For now." Kyle rose from his seat, his gaze fixed on the anomaly. "Pull us back." Rin looked up sharply. "Captain!" "Do it," Kale ordered, his tone brooking no argument. Hellar adjusted the controls, and the ship drifted back, creating distance between the Etherian and the anomaly. The shuddering subsided, though the distortion on the display remained as violent as ever. Kale exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing. "We can't proceed blind. Rin, I need every piece of information you can extract from that signal. Work with Dr. Liren. She might make sense of this chaos." Rin nodded, already gathering his data onto a portable console. "I'll coordinate with her now." Kyle turned to Hellar. "Keep us in a stable position. I don't want this ship drifting closer without my approval." "Yes, sir," Hellar said, his voice tinged with relief. Rin left the bridge, his steps quick but purposeful. The corridor outside the command deck stretched long and sterile, its walls gleaming faintly under dim, artificial lighting. The faint hum of machinery whispered beneath his feet, a constant reminder of the Etherian's pulse. He pushed through the hatch leading to the research bay, his thoughts racing as fast as his heartbeat. Inside, Dr. Liren worked alone, her figure illuminated by the cascading light of holographic displays. The air here was cooler, touched with the sharp tang of sterilization, but there was an almost soothing quality to the rhythmic beeping of her instruments. She didn't look up as Rin approached, her focus razor-sharp on the streams of equations unraveling before her. "Doctor," Rin began, his voice breaking the stillness. She straightened, her sharp blue eyes meeting his. "Lieutenant, you've brought me something interesting, I assume." "I'm not sure interesting is the word," Rin said, setting the portable console on her station. "The signal we detected, it's reacting to us, and now it's coming from that." He gestured to the holographic display of the anomaly. Dr. Liren frowned, her brow furrowing as she studied the data. Her hands moved swiftly, pulling up additional overlays and running simulations in real time. "This pattern," she murmured, almost to herself. "It's layered. Purposeful." "Purposeful?" Rin echoed, leaning closer. "As in intelligent?" "Potentially," she replied, her tone cautious. "But there's something strange about it. The fluctuations, they're distorted, almost like echoes, as though this signal has been bouncing through time." The words sent a shiver down Rin's spine. Bouncing through time? How is that even possible? Before Rin could answer, the anomaly pulsed violently, and the bridge lights dimmed once more. A low vibration resonated through the ship's frame, deeper and more guttural than before, as if the void itself were growling in protest. Sparks leaped from a nearby console, and one of the technicians cursed under his breath, recoiling. "Shields are holding," Hellar said, his tone steady but taut. "For now." Kale rose from his seat, his gaze fixed on the anomaly. "Pull us back." Rin looked up sharply. "Captain!" "Do it," Kale ordered, his tone brooking no argument. Hellar adjusted the controls, and the ship drifted back, creating distance between the Etherian and the anomaly. The shuddering subsided, though the distortion on the display remained as violent as ever. Kale exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing. "We can't proceed blind. Rin, I need every piece of information you can extract from that signal. Work with Dr. Liren. She might make sense of this chaos." Rin nodded, already gathering his data onto a portable console. "I'll coordinate with her now." Kale turned to Hellar. "Keep us in a stable position. I don't want this ship drifting closer without my approval." "Yes, sir," Hellar said, his voice tinged with relief. Rin left the bridge, his steps quick but purposeful. The corridor outside the command deck stretched long and sterile, its walls gleaming faintly under dim, artificial lighting. The faint hum of machinery whispered beneath his feet, a constant reminder of the Etherean's pulse. He pushed through the hatch leading to the research bay, his thoughts racing as fast as his heartbeat. Inside, Dr. Liren worked alone, her figure illuminated by the cascading light of holographic displays. The air here was cooler, touched with the sharp tang of sterilization, but there was an almost soothing quality to the rhythmic beeping of her instruments. She didn't look up as Rin approached, her focus razor-sharp on the streams of equations unraveling before her. "Doctor," Rin began, his voice breaking the stillness. She straightened, her sharp blue eyes meeting his. "Lieutenant, you've brought me something interesting, I assume?" "I'm not sure interesting is the word," Rin said, setting the portable console on her station. "The signal we detected, it's reacting to us, and now it's coming from that." He gestured to the holographic display of the anomaly. Dr. Liren frowned, her brow furrowing as she studied the data. Her hands moved swiftly, pulling up additional overlays and running simulations in real time. "This pattern," she murmured almost to herself, "it's layered, purposeful." "Purposeful?" Rin echoed, leaning closer. "As in intelligent?" "Potentially," she replied, her tone cautious. "But there's something strange about it. The fluctuations, they're distorted, almost like echoes, as though this signal has been bouncing through time." The word sent a shiver down Rin's spine. Bouncing through time? How is that even possible? Rin hesitated. "Captain, with all due respect—" "We need answers, Lieutenant," Cale interrupted, his tone brooking no dissent. "And this might be our only chance to get them." Rin nodded reluctantly, his fingers tightening around the datapad. "Understood." The shuttle cut through the distortion like a blade, its hull groaning faintly under the strain of the anomaly's unnatural forces. Cale sat rigid in his seat, his hand gripping the armrest as the shuttle trembled. Around him the landing party, Rin, Dr. Liren, and 2 security officers, prepared for the unknown. The air inside the cabin was thick with tension, the weight of unspoken fears pressing on them all. Ahead, the structure loomed, its surface riddled with scars that glinted faintly in the anomaly's cold light. It resembled a fortress, its jagged walls rising defiantly against the chaos around it. The shuttle docked with a metallic clang, the sound reverberating through the cabin like a heartbeat. As the airlock hissed open, a rush of stale, chilled air greeted them. It carried a faint metallic tang, sharp and bitter, as though the structure itself exhaled its ancient secrets. Cale stepped forward, his boots clicking against the steel floor. The interior was vast and dimly lit, the walls covered in layers of corrosion that seemed to pulse faintly with the anomaly's energy. "Stay sharp," Cale said, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. He glanced at Rin, who was scanning the area with a handheld device. "Anything?" "Faint energy readings," Rin replied, his voice hushed. "It's like the entire structure is in a state of suspended animation." Dr. Liren stepped closer to one of the walls, her fingers brushing against the rough surface. Her brow furrowed as she traced the faint symbols etched into the metal, patterns that seemed to shift under her touch. "These markings, they're not decorative. They're instructions." Kyle frowned. "Instructions for what?" "I don't know yet," she admitted, her tone distant as she continued to study the wall. "But they're layered, almost like a puzzle." Further inside, the corridor widened into a cavernous chamber, its ceiling disappearing into shadows. In the center stood a massive console, its surface smooth and unblemished, a stark contrast to the decayed surroundings. It glowed faintly, lines of light tracing its edges like veins. Kyle approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of movement. "Rin, can you interface with it?" Rin hesitated, then stepped forward, his fingers hovering over the console's surface. The moment he touched it, the lights in the chamber flared, bathing them in a cold, sterile glow. The console came to life, its surface shifting to reveal a holographic display that filled the room with cascading streams of data. "This is advanced," Rin murmured, his voice tinged with awe. "Far more than anything we've encountered before." Cale's gaze hardened. "Human?" Most likely, Rin said, his fingers working rapidly to decode the information. But it's fragmented. Whatever system this is, it's barely functioning. Dr. Liren moved closer, her eyes narrowing as she studied the holographic display. These equations, they're not just scientific, they're defensive. Whoever built this was trying to contain something. Cale felt a chill creep down his spine. Contain what? Liren's expression darkened. Something they feared enough to build all of this. Before she could elaborate, the console emitted a low, pulsing tone. The holographic display shifted, revealing a new set of data, schematics for a weapon. It was massive, its design both elegant and brutal, with intricate mechanisms that seemed to hum with destructive potential. A weapon, Rin said, his voice hollow. But it's incomplete. Can it be finished? Cale asked, his tone sharp. Maybe, Rin replied, his fingers flying over the console, but the energy requirements are astronomical, and without knowing what it's meant to fight, we don't have the luxury of waiting, Cale said, his jaw tightening. If this is humanity's legacy, we need to understand it, quickly. The lights in the chamber flickered, and the console's glow dimmed. A new sound filled the air, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It wasn't mechanical, nor was it natural. It was alive, and it was angry. Cale drew his weapon instinctively, his gaze sweeping the room. What was that? Liren's voice was tense. Something is reacting to us. The vibration grew stronger, the walls trembling as though under immense strain. The floor beneath them shifted slightly. A subtle yet unmistakable warning. "Captain!" Rin called out, his tone urgent. "We need to leave! Now!" Cale didn't hesitate. "Fall back to the shuttle! Move!" The team rushed back through the corridor, their footsteps echoing in the structure's oppressive silence. Behind them, the vibrations deepened, the walls groaning as cracks began to spread. Kyle glanced over his shoulder, his gut twisting at the sight of faint, flickering lights chasing them through the darkness. They reached the airlock just as the structure shuddered violently, a deafening roar erupting from deep within. Kyle shoved Rin and Liren into the shuttle, slamming the hatch shut as the vibrations reached a crescendo. "Launch!" he barked. The shuttle detached just as the structure erupted in a cascade of energy, the distortion consuming it in a blinding flash. As the light faded, the anomaly's pulsations grew stronger, more erratic, as though it had been awakened. Kyle sank into his seat, his mind racing. Whatever they had uncovered wasn't just humanity's past. It was its unfinished war. And something had just begun to stir. The Etherian trembled under the weight of the anomaly's reverberations as the shuttle docked. The crew on the bridge stood tense, their gazes glued to the growing distortion on the main display. The once subtle flickers had transformed into jagged pulses of light, each burst sharp enough to make the screen stutter. It was as if the anomaly had taken on a life of its own, and now it was calling out. Cale Orris stepped back onto the bridge, his boots landing heavily on the polished deck. His mind churned with the discovery, a weapon, incomplete and enigmatic, left behind by a civilization that had faced annihilation. Whatever the humans had tried to stop, it wasn't gone. He could feel it in the air, a cold, creeping pressure that whispered of something ancient and relentless. "Report," Cale commanded, his voice cutting through the tension. Halar turned from his station, his expression grim. The anomaly's energy output is escalating exponentially. It's destabilizing space-time in a 2-light-year radius. The gravitational flux is pulling in debris from surrounding systems. Cale's jaw tightened. "And the structure?" "Gone," Halar replied. "The energy surge consumed it completely. All that's left is—" He gestured toward the display where fragments of twisted metal floated in eerie silence, backlit by the pulsing light. Rin, standing by the console, added, "The signal hasn't stopped. If anything, it's amplifying. It's almost as if it's broadcasting a response." "A response to what?" Kyle asked, his voice low. Before Rin could reply, an alert blared across the bridge. The sharp tones were like daggers to the ears, jarring the crew into motion. Halar's hands flew across his console, his normally steady demeanor slipping. "Unidentified objects inbound," Hellar said, his tone taut with urgency. "Multiple signatures, emerging from hyperspace." Kyle stepped closer to the main display as the sensor feed updated. Points of light appeared, each one a jagged burst of energy, unlike any ship they had ever encountered. The objects moved with an unnatural fluidity, their forms shifting and distorting like reflections on water. It wasn't just their appearance that was alien, it was their very existence. "Distance?" Kyle snapped. 2 million kilometers and closing fast, Hellar replied. "Estimate contact in 5 minutes." Kyle's stomach knotted. "Shields up, ready weapons, this isn't a coincidence." The bridge lights dimmed momentarily as the ship's systems recalibrated, focusing energy toward defense. Kyle turned to Rin. "What do we know about these things?" "Barely anything," Rin admitted, his fingers working feverishly to analyze the incoming data. "Their energy signatures are erratic, like they're phasing in and out of this dimension. But the signal, it's tied to them." "Tied how?" Kale demanded. Rin hesitated, then said, "The same quantum patterns in the signal are present in their movements. It's like they're following its coordinates." "They're answering it," Kale muttered, his voice weighted with realization. "And we're caught in the middle." The ship's proximity alarm shrieked again, louder this time. On the display, the alien vessels drew closer, their shifting forms casting elongated shadows across the void. Kale's gut tightened as he studied their approach. Each movement felt deliberate, predatory, as if they were assessing their prey. "Hellar," Kale ordered, his tone sharp and decisive. "Evasive maneuvers. Keep us out of their direct path." "Yes, sir," Hellar replied, his hand steady despite the tension radiating through the bridge. The Etherian banked hard, its thrusters firing in controlled bursts as it shifted away from the alien fleet. The change in trajectory was seamless, but Kale could feel the strain rippling through the ship's systems, a low vibration deep within the walls, a reminder of the immense forces at play. "Captain," one of the technicians called out, her voice tight with fear, "they're accelerating. They're matching our course." Kale's eyes narrowed. "Weapon status?" "Online," Hellar confirmed. "But I don't know if they'll make a dent in whatever those things are." Kale's voice hardened. "We'll find out. Target the lead ship and fire on my command." The bridge fell into a tense silence as the crew prepared for engagement. The alien vessels loomed larger on the display, their distorted shapes pulsating with otherworldly light. Kale gripped the edge of his console, his knuckles white against the dark surface. "Fire," he ordered. The ship's weapons discharged in a synchronized volley, streaks of light cutting through the void. The projectiles hit their targets with precision, but instead of exploding, they vanished, absorbed into the alien vessels like raindrops into sand. The enemy ships didn't falter. If anything, they seemed to grow stronger, their pulsations intensifying. "Direct hits," Hellar reported, his voice strained. "No damage." Kale's jaw tightened. "Keep firing. Don't let them close the gap." The Etherian unleashed another barrage, but the results were the same. The alien vessels continued their relentless pursuit, their forms shifting and distorting as they moved closer. The display flickered, interference rippling through the feed as the anomaly's influence grew stronger. "Captain," Rin said, his tone urgent, "we're not dealing with conventional ships. Their forms are unstable, like they're partially existing in another dimension. Our weapons aren't designed for this." Kale's mind raced, searching for a solution. The tension in the room was suffocating, each second stretching unbearably. He could feel the eyes of his crew on him, their unspoken fears pressing down like a weight. "Hellar," Kale said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Prepare to redirect all power to shields. Rin, keep analyzing their patterns. Find me a weakness." Before either could respond, the ship shuddered violently. The lights flickered, and a sound like grinding metal reverberated through the bridge. Kale braced himself against the console, his heart pounding as alarms blared across the room. "They've latched onto us," Hellar said, his voice taut with urgency. "Some kind of energy tether. It's pulling us toward the anomaly." Kale's blood ran cold. "Reverse thrusters. Break us free." "Trying," Hellar replied, his hands flying over the controls. But their energy field is overwhelming. We're losing ground. The ship groaned again, the vibrations deep and visceral. Kale's mind raced, every option feeling more desperate than the last. He turned to Rin, who was staring intently at his console, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Rin," Kale said sharply, "talk to me." Rin looked up, his expression grim. "The signal isn't just a warning, it's a beacon. And whatever these things are, they're not just following it, they're protecting it." Kale's throat tightened. Protecting it from what? Rin hesitated, then said, "Us." Kale's stomach twisted. He glanced at the display where the alien vessels pulsed with increasing intensity. The anomaly behind them churned violently, its edges fraying like torn fabric. Whatever lay within it was vast, incomprehensible, and waking. "Halar," Kale said, his voice steel. "Keep us steady. Rin, find me a way to break this tether. If these things are protecting the signal, we need to figure out why. Fast." Rin nodded, his hands moving with renewed urgency. The bridge fell into a tense silence. The crew focused on their tasks, even as the alien vessels tightened their grip. Kyle stood at the center of it all, his mind sharp, his resolve unshaken. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing with chilling certainty. This was only the beginning. The Etherian hung precariously in the shadow of the anomaly, the alien vessels circling like predators toying with their prey. The bridge was a storm of tension, every crew member's movements sharp and precise, yet weighed down by the mounting dread. The air crackled with a palpable charge, the unseen forces pressing against the ship like a tidal wave, threatening to break. Kyle Orris paced in tight, deliberate steps, his mind a battlefield of calculations and instinct. He stopped near Rin, who was bent over his console, his face illuminated by cascading streams of data. "Anything we can use?" Kale asked, his tone as taut as a bowstring. Rin didn't look up, his fingers working feverishly. Their energy patterns are becoming more synchronized with the signal. It's like they're tethering themselves to it, feeding off it. "Feeding off it?" Kale's brow furrowed. "For what purpose?" Rin shook his head, frustration flickering across his face. "I don't know yet, but the signal is changing. The patterns are evolving, almost like it's adapting to their presence." Kyle exhaled sharply, turning to Halar. "Keep us steady. I need every second you can buy." Halar's jaw tightened, his focus unflinching. "I'll do what I can, but their grip is tightening. If we don't figure something out soon—" "We will," Kyle interrupted, his voice firm. "We have to." The ship trembled again, a deep, resonant vibration that echoed through the walls and settled in their bones. The anomaly flared on the display, its jagged edges glowing with an intensity that burned into their eyes. Kyle squinted against the light, his chest tightening as he watched the alien vessels twist and shift, their forms becoming more erratic and fragmented. "Captain," Rin said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence like a gunshot. "I've isolated a new sequence in the signal. It's coordinates." Kyle moved to Rin's station, his eyes narrowing at the lines of code dancing across the screen. "Coordinates to where?" Rin hesitated, his gaze flicking to the anomaly. "Inside." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Kyle felt his pulse quicken, a mixture of fear and determination flooding his veins. "You're saying there's something inside the anomaly? Something the signal is leading us to?" "It's possible," Rin said, his voice low. "But the distortion makes it impossible to see what's on the other side. If we go in, we're flying blind." Kale straightened, his mind racing. The pieces were starting to come together, a signal, a weapon, and now a destination hidden within the chaos. It wasn't coincidence. It was a plan, left behind by a civilization that had faced annihilation and left breadcrumbs for those who followed. "Halar," Kyle said, his voice steady but grim. "Prepare the ship for entry." Halar's head snapped toward him, his eyes widening. "Entry?" "Captain, with all due respect." "We don't have a choice," Kale cut him off. "Whatever's inside that anomaly, it's the key to understanding this, to stopping it." Halar hesitated, then nodded, his hands moving over the controls. The ship groaned faintly as its trajectory adjusted, aligning with the anomaly's pulsating center. The air on the bridge grew heavier, charged with the weight of impending action. Dr. Liren entered the bridge, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "I assume we're about to do something extraordinarily reckless," she said dryly. Kale turned to her, his face set. "Reckless, but necessary. Rin's identified coordinates within the anomaly. We're going in." Liren raised an eyebrow. "I hope you're ready for what's on the other side." Kale met her gaze. "Are we ever?" The Etherian edged closer to the anomaly, its shimmering surface filling the viewport like a cosmic maelstrom. The distortion was a symphony of chaos, light and shadow colliding in a dance that defied comprehension. Kale stood at the helm, his hands gripping the console as the ship's system strained against the pull of the anomaly. "Shields holding at 60%, Hellar reported, his voice tight. "But this isn't going to last long." "Keep them up as long as you can," Kale replied. "Once we're inside, we'll need every ounce of power to stabilize." The ship crossed the threshold, and the world dissolved into light. For a brief, agonizing moment, the bridge was engulfed in a brilliance so intense it felt as though the universe had imploded. The light burned into their retinas, leaving ghostly afterimages that danced in the void. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded. What remained was silence. Not the absence of sound, but a silence so profound it pressed against their ears, their minds, their very souls. The air felt heavier, charged with an almost magnetic pull, as though the anomaly itself had swallowed them whole. Kale blinked, his vision adjusting to the new reality. The anomaly's interior was vast, an expanse of shifting, translucent planes that stretched into infinity. The space pulsed with a rhythmic energy, the vibrations resonating through the ship like the echo of a heartbeat. "Status?" Kale asked, his voice cutting through the oppressive stillness. "Shields at 30%, Hellar replied, his tone clipped. "We're holding, but barely." Rin leaned over his console, his fingers trembling as he analyzed the readings. "Captain, this place, it's not just a location, it's a construct. The signal didn't just lead us here, it created this." Kale's brow furrowed. "Created it for what?" Before Rin could answer, the anomaly's pulse intensified. The translucent planes around them shifted, forming intricate patterns that seemed to ripple with intention. In the distance, a shape emerged, a massive structure, its jagged edges glinting with an otherworldly light. "That's it," Rin said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The coordinates led us to that." Kale's gaze hardened. "Hellar, take us in closer, slowly." The ship edged toward the structure, its surface reflecting the anomaly's chaotic light in strange, hypnotic patterns. As they neared, the details became clearer, walls etched with symbols, intricate mechanisms pulsing faintly with energy. It was a fusion of engineering and art, a testament to a civilization that had wielded power beyond comprehension. "Liren," Kale said, turning to her, "what do you make of this?" She stepped closer to the viewport, her eyes narrowing as she studied the structure. "It's not just a weapon, it's a containment system. Whatever the humans built this for, they weren't trying to destroy it. They were trying to lock it away." Kale's chest tightened, and now it's waking up. The ship shuddered again, the vibrations deeper this time, resonating with the anomaly's pulse. The alien vessels reappeared on the display, their distorted forms closing in around the structure like a swarm of vultures. "They're not attacking," Rin said, his tone laced with unease. "They're guarding it." Kale's jaw clenched. "Guarding it from us? Or something inside?" Liren turned to him, her expression grim. "Either way, Captain, we're out of time." The Etherian hung in the void, dwarfed by the massive structure ahead. The alien vessels encircled it with an eerie rhythm, their distorted forms pulsating like fragmented reflections on water. Kale Orris stood at the helm, his eyes locked on the shimmering construct in the distance. It loomed like a tombstone carved from light and shadow, its edges sharp enough to cut through the chaotic pulse of the anomaly. "Hellar," Kyle said, his voice low but commanding, "hold this position. Don't let us drift any closer. until we understand what's ahead." Hilar gave a terse nod, his hand steady as they worked the controls. "Understood, Captain. Stabilizing our trajectory." The air on the bridge felt charged, a subtle weight pressing against their senses as though the anomaly itself were watching. Cale's gaze shifted to Rin, who was hunched over his console, his fingers flying across the interface. The cascading streams of data reflected in his wide eyes. "What are you seeing, Rin?" Kyle asked, his tone sharp. Rin hesitated, his jaw tightening before he spoke. "The signal is intensifying, Captain. Whatever this structure is, it's responding to our presence. The energy fluctuations, they're synchronizing with the anomaly." Cale crossed his arms, the tension in his shoulders mirroring the atmosphere on the bridge. "And the alien ships? Are they reacting to us?" "They're holding their formation," Rin replied, his voice tight. "But their energy signatures are spiking. It's like they're preparing for something." "Or protecting something," Dr. Liren added, stepping closer to the viewport. Her gaze was fixed on the structure, her expression a mix of curiosity and unease. "This isn't just a weapon, Captain, it's a vault. The humans built it to contain something, and whatever's inside, it's not meant to be let out." Cale's jaw clenched. "Then why did they leave the signal? Why lead anyone here if it's so dangerous?" Liren turned to him, her voice measured. "Maybe they didn't have a choice. Maybe this was their last warning, and their last hope." Before Cale could respond, the ship shuddered violently, throwing several crew members off balance. The lights flickered, and a deep vibration reverberated through the walls, the sound resonating in their chests. On the main display, the alien ships began to shift, their distorted forms rippling as though caught in a turbulent current. "They're moving," Hilar said, his voice taut, "closing in on the structure." Cale's gaze snapped to the display. The alien vessels were no longer circling. They were converging, their movements synchronized in a way that felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. The energy around them intensified, casting flickering shadows across the bridge. "Captain," Rin said urgently, "the structure's energy output is spiking. If this continues—" "Hilar," Kyle interrupted, his voice steel. "Bring us in closer. If the structure is responding to them, we need to see it up close." Hilar hesitated, his brow furrowing, but he obeyed. The Etherian inched forward, the shimmering construct growing larger with every passing second. The closer they got, the more intricate the structure became. Its surface was etched with patterns that shifted and glowed, each line pulsating with a rhythm that seemed to echo the anomaly itself. "This is incredible," Liren murmured, her voice filled with quiet awe. "These markings, they're not just decoration. They're functional. It's a system. An interface." "An interface for what?" Cale asked, his voice sharp. Liren turned to him, her expression grim. "For control. If the humans built this to contain something, these patterns are the key to activating it. Or destroying it." Cale's chest tightened. "Rin, can you interface with it remotely?" Rin shook his head, his fingers flying across his console. "Number, the interference is too strong. We'd have to dock with the structure and access it manually." The ship shuddered again, the vibrations deeper this time. On the display, the alien vessels began to emit beams of light, each one converging on the structure's center. The beams pulsed in unison, their intensity growing with each cycle. "They're trying to breach it," Liren said, her voice rising with urgency. "Whatever's inside, they want it out." Cale's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle snapping together in a horrifying realization. "Hilar, get us to that structure, now!" The Etherian surged forward, its thrusters straining against the anomaly's pull. The alien vessels didn't react, their focus locked on the structure as their beams intensified. Cale's stomach churned as the ship approached the shimmering construct, its surface glowing brighter with every second. "Prepare the landing team," Cale ordered, his voice cutting through the tension. "Liren, Rin, you're with me. Hilar, hold position and keep the ship ready for immediate extraction." Hilar nodded, his hand steady on the controls. "Understood, Captain. But make it quick. I don't like the look of this." Neither did Cale, but he didn't say it. Instead, he led the team to the shuttle bay, the air growing colder as they descended. The shuttle itself felt suffocatingly small as they boarded, its interior illuminated by harsh, flickering lights. The journey to the structure was short but tense, the shuttle rattling as it passed through the anomaly's fluctuating energy field. When they docked, the airlock hissed open, revealing the structure's interior. The atmosphere was heavy, the air dense and metallic, carrying an almost oppressive stillness. Cale stepped forward, his boots echoing against the smooth, glowing floor. The walls were covered in the same shifting patterns they'd seen from the ship, each line pulsing faintly with light. The temperature was unnervingly cold, biting at their skin and sending a shiver through the team. "This place feels alive," Liren said, her voice barely above a whisper. Rin moved to a nearby console, his fingers brushing against the glowing patterns. "The energy here is immense. It's like standing inside a reactor on the verge of overload." Cale's gaze scanned the room, his instincts prickling. "Can you access the interface?" "I'll try," Rin said, his voice tight with concentration. As Rin worked, the structure began to tremble, the vibrations growing stronger with each passing second. The light around them intensified, casting sharp, shifting shadows across the walls. Cale felt his pulse quicken, a deep sense of foreboding settling in his chest. "Captain," Liren said, her tone urgent, "we need to hurry. The alien ships are destabilizing the containment field. If they succeed—" "I know," Cale said, his voice firm. "Rin, what's the status?" "Almost there," Rin replied, his fingers moving faster. "Just a few more." A deafening roar echoed through the structure, a sound so deep it felt like the air itself was fracturing. Kyle turned toward the source, his heart pounding as he saw the walls begin to split, the glowing patterns warping and collapsing. "Captain," Liren said, her voice trembling, "the containment is failing." Cale's jaw tightened. "Then we stop it, whatever it takes." The structure groaned, its walls trembling as the glowing patterns across its surface unraveled into chaotic spirals. Cale Orris steadied himself against the nearest console, the vibrations clawing at his balance. The sound wasn't mechanical, it was deeper, like the earth itself was tearing open beneath them. A low, guttural rumble pressed against his chest, the air thick with static tension. "Rin! Status!" Cale barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. Rin's fingers flew over the console, sweat glistening on his brow despite the chilling cold that seeped through the structure. "I'm almost through. The interface is resisting, but there's a failsafe. It's buried deep, but I can reach it." "Define failsafe," Liren demanded, her sharp gaze darting between the crumbling walls and Rin's screen. Rin's jaw tightened, his voice clipped as he answered. "A sequence. It's tied to the containment field and the weapons system. If I activate it, the entire structure will collapse in on itself. Dimensional lock. Everything. But—" He hesitated. "But what?" Kyle pressed. Rin met his eyes, his expression grim. "It'll destroy everything within a 5-light-year radius." The weight of the words settled over them like a suffocating blanket. Liren inhaled sharply, her breath visible in the cold. "That's not just this ship. That's an entire sector." Cale's mind raced, his thoughts a torrent of calculations and worst-case scenarios. The alien vessels outside were relentless, their energy beams carving into the structure with increasing precision. Each strike sent shock waves reverberating through the walls, shaking loose debris and fracturing the floor beneath their feet. "They're trying to release whatever's inside," Cale said, his tone resolute. "If we don't stop them, this isn't just a sector at risk. It's the galaxy." Liren stepped closer, her voice low but firm. "Then we need a plan, one that buys us time to evacuate the sector. If we can alert nearby system—" "There's no time," Cale interrupted, his eyes narrowing as he addressed Rin. "If we activate this failsafe, how much time do we have before it triggers?" Rin glanced at his screen, the data cascading like a waterfall of numbers and symbols. 3 minutes, maybe 4 if the sequence holds stable. "Not enough to warn anyone," Cale said, his voice hardening. He turned to Liran. "Can the signal be repurposed? If we amplify it, can it reach beyond this sector?" Liran's eyes flickered with realization. "It's possible. The signal is already tied to the containment system. If we hijack it, we might be able to broadcast a warning." Do it, Kyle ordered. Rin, focus on the fail-safe. Liren, you're on the signal. Hilar, keep the ship steady and prep for extraction. As the team moved into action, Kale's gaze returned to the crumbling walls. The patterns were collapsing faster now, their once coherent designs unraveling into jagged, erratic lines. The air around him seemed heavier, as if the structure's very existence was buckling under its own weight. "Captain," Rin called out, his voice tight with urgency. "Fail-safe sequence is prepped, but I need your authorization to initiate." Kale moved to the console, his fingers hovering over the control panel. "Is there any way to contain the blast, even partially?" Rin shook his head. "Not with what we've got. This thing was designed to be absolute." Kale exhaled slowly, his chest tight with the enormity of the decision. His hand steadied, and he keyed in the authorization code. "Begin the sequence." A low, rhythmic pulse echoed through the structure as the failsafe engaged. The glowing patterns across the walls flickered, their intensity surging before stabilizing into a cold, steady light. Rin's console displayed a countdown, each second ticking away with an almost mocking finality. "Signal is live," Liren announced, her voice cutting through the tension. "I've tied it to the containment system and boosted the frequency. It'll reach nearby systems, but we're pushing the limits of the structure's integrity." "Push harder," Kale said. "If this is the last thing we do, we make sure they know why." The structure shuddered violently, a deafening crack splitting the air as one of the walls collapsed inward. The energy beams from the alien vessels intensified, their relentless assault driving deeper into the structure's core. Kale turned to Liren, his voice sharp. "How long until the signal broadcasts fully?" 30 seconds, she replied, her hands moving with practiced precision. "But if the structure collapses before then—" "It won't," Kale said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. The ship's intercom crackled to life, Halar's voice cutting through the static. "Captain, the alien vessels are closing in. They're ignoring us and focusing entirely on the structure. If we don't move now—" "We're not leaving," Kale interrupted. "Hold position until the signal transmits." Halar's reply was terse. "Understood." The countdown on Rin's console ticked down to 2 minutes. Kyle's pulse pounded in his ears. Every muscle in his body coiled with tension. He could feel the weight of every life in the sector pressing on him, the crushing responsibility of a choice that had no perfect outcome. The structure trembled again, the vibrations growing sharper and more erratic. The floor beneath them cracked, faint wisps of light seeping through the fissures like a dying star's last gasp. Kyle steadied himself, his gaze fixed on the countdown. "Signal transmission complete," Liren shouted, her voice cutting through the din. "It's out there. They'll know." Kyle nodded, his chest tightening with both relief and sorrow. "Hilar, prepare for extraction." Before the order could be executed, the structure emitted a piercing sound, a high-pitched wail that seemed to come from every direction at once. The alien vessels outside froze in place, their distorted forms rippling as though caught in a storm. The beams of light they had been firing wavered, then dissipated entirely. "What's happening?" Liren asked, her voice trembling with both fear and fascination. "They know what's coming," Kale said, his voice grim. "And they're afraid." The countdown reached 30 seconds. Kale moved to the shuttle's intercom, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Hilar, bring us back. Full speed." The shuttle detached from the structure, its thrusters straining against the anomaly's pull. The alien vessels began to move again, their chaotic forms scattering as though retreating from the impending blast. Kyle watched them go, his chest tightening with a mixture of triumph and grief. As the shuttle docked with the Etherian, Kale turned to Rin and Liren. "Get us out of here, now!" The ship lurched forward, its engines roaring as it tore away from the anomaly. Behind them, the structure's light intensified, growing brighter and sharper with each passing second. Kale stood at the viewport, his gaze fixed on the distant construct. The countdown reached 0. A blinding flash consumed the structure, the light expanding outward in a wave of impossible brilliance. The anomaly collapsed in on itself, the energy folding and twisting until it vanished entirely. The alien vessels caught in the blast disintegrated, their forms dissolving into fragments of light and shadow. Kale turned away from the viewport, his chest heavy with the weight of their actions. He met the eyes of his crew, their expressions a mirror of his own, grim, resolute, and unshaken. "It's done," he said quietly, "and they'll remember why." The silence following the detonation was unnatural, a void where even thought seemed to falter. Cale Orris stood frozen at the viewport, the afterimage of the brilliant explosion seared into his vision. Beyond the glass, the stars seemed dimmer, as though the universe itself had flinched from what had transpired. The structure was gone, consumed by its own fury, and with it, the alien vessels that had sought to unleash its secrets. Cale exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the chill that permeated the bridge. The atmosphere aboard the Etherian was heavy, every crew member lost in the enormity of what they had witnessed. No one spoke, as if to do so would shatter the fragile balance holding them upright. Rin broke the silence first, his voice quiet but firm. "The containment worked. The anomaly's energy signature has disappeared completely." Cale nodded but didn't look away from the viewport. His hands tightened on the console in front of him, his knuckles pale against the dark surface. "What about the signal?" Liren stepped forward, her gaze fixed on her console, as streams of data reflected in her sharp eyes. "The signal is still active. It's weaker, but it's spreading. The warning will reach the systems we targeted, and beyond." Kyle finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Will they understand it?" Liren hesitated, then nodded slowly. "They'll know it wasn't just a message. It's a call to act." To prepare, Cale glanced at the remaining crew. Halar stood rigid at his station, his weathered features betraying the weight of what they had done. The others avoided Cale's gaze, their silence speaking louder than words. He took a slow step toward the center of the bridge, his voice low but steady. "We did what we had to. If that thing had gotten out—" "It would have been the end," Rin finished, his voice thick with a mixture of pride and grief. "We stopped it." "At a cost," Hellar muttered, his tone laced with quiet bitterness. "That sector is gone, Captain. Billions of lives, wiped out in an instant." Kyle's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the weight of Hellar's words settle over him, their truth undeniable. Finally, he said, "We had no choice." "Didn't we?" Hellar snapped, his composure cracking. "We're supposed to protect life, not end it. Was there really no other way?" Kyle stepped closer, his voice sharp but controlled. "We didn't destroy those lives. We saved them. Every system beyond that sector now has a chance to prepare, to survive. If we'd done nothing, the entire galaxy would have been at risk." Hellar's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him as quickly as it had surged. "I know. It just doesn't feel like a victory." "It never does," Kyle said softly, his gaze steady. "Not when the cost is this high." Liren cleared her throat, drawing their attention back to the console. "There's something else. The signal. It's not just a warning. It's evolving." Cale frowned, stepping closer. "Evolving how?" Liren tapped a series of commands, and the bridge's main display flickered to life. The patterns from the signal unfolded across the screen, shifting and rearranging like a living organism. The signal was designed to adapt. It's incorporating what we've done, our actions, the failsafe, everything. It's becoming a record, a testament to what happened here. "A legacy," Rin said quietly, his eyes locked on the screen. "It's telling our story." Cale's chest tightened at the thought. Humanity's warning had been a cry in the dark, a desperate plea from a civilization that had already fallen. And now, their story, the story of those who had followed, fought, and sacrificed, was becoming part of that legacy, a new thread in the tapestry of survival. "What does it mean for us?" Kyle asked, his voice low. Liren glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "It means they'll remember. Whoever hears this signal, they'll know what we faced, what we gave." Kyle's gaze returned to the viewport, where the stars seemed to shimmer with newfound clarity. He could almost feel the weight of those watching, the countless lives out there who would one day hear the warning and know the choice they'd made. "We've done our part," he said finally. "Now it's up to them." The bridge fell silent again, the only sound the quiet beeps of the ship's systems recalibrating. Cale turned back to his crew, his voice steady despite the storm raging within him. "Hellar, plot a course to the nearest safe system. We need to regroup and report what's happened." Hellar nodded, his hands moving over the controls with practiced efficiency. The ship shifted slightly, the stars outside tilting as they adjusted their trajectory. Kyle felt the faint vibration beneath his feet, a steady rhythm that anchored him in the present. As the ship moved away from the remnants of the anomaly, Kyle allowed himself a moment to breathe. His mind drifted to the faces of those who had come before, the humans who had built the structure, who had sacrificed everything to leave behind a warning they knew might never be heard. Their voices echoed in his thoughts, a quiet but unyielding reminder of what it meant to stand against the dark. "Do you think they ever expected this?" Rin asked, breaking the silence. "That their warning would survive this long? That someone would answer it?" Cale's lips pressed into a thin line as he considered the question. Maybe they didn't need to. Maybe all they needed was the hope that someone would try. Rin nodded, his expression pensive. "Do you think we'll ever know what they were running from? What they tried to stop?" Kyle's gaze hardened, his voice steady. "We don't need to know. We've seen enough to understand what's at stake. That's what matters." The ship's intercom crackled, Hellar's voice cutting through. "Course is set, Captain. We're clear of the anomaly." Kale nodded, his shoulders easing slightly. "Good. Keep us steady." As the Etherian slipped into the safety of hyperspace, Kale allowed himself a final glance at the viewport. The empty expanse beyond was deceptively calm, the remnants of their battle already fading into memory. But the signal remained, a beacon in the dark, carrying their story to whoever might follow. And with it, the simple, chilling words that had started it all. Run.